And we are live. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Reedsy Live. I'm Martin from the team at Reedsy. We're a platform that connects authors with the best professionals in the world of publishing. And this is Reedsy Live, where those publishing professionals will show you how to write and publish better books today. We have a very special guest in the form of Devin Hunt. He's the founder of Useful Books, who helps authors go out there into the world and create useful books that people will want to recommend, for that is indeed the topic of this talk tonight. We'll bring him on in just a minute. But while everybody's rolling in, do let me know where you're coming from today. Let's see who's here already. We have Catherine Walker from North Carolina. SD Gardens, hello. Hi, Denise. Good to see you again from Jamaica. Rebecca from Duluth, Minnesota. Scrolling a bit further down, Mark from Tulsa, Oklahoma. Charlene, also from Tulsa. Sylvie from Morelia, Michoacan. I think that's... Is that Mexico, perhaps? Tyler from Huntington Beach, California. Wonderful. Good to see so many of you live. Before I bring on my guests, just a bit of housekeeping to get that out the way. This is being live streamed, but you can catch the replay at any point in the future. Devin, our guest, will be sharing a slide deck in there. In the past we would have sent it around, but this is a live stream that you can publicly access, so you can go back and just sort of scroll and pause and all that. There's details of his company and the book he'll talk about in the video description below, so make sure you hit that along with the like and subscribe button. Okay, all housekeeping out of the way. I believe I'm good to go, so let's start the title sequence. Hello and welcome to Reedsy Live, the ongoing series of live streams where professionals from the world of publishing will show you how to write and publish better books. Today we're talking about both sides of that equation. My name is Martin. I'm your host based here in the UK with a team at Reedsy. Of course, that's where people go to connect with some of the world's finest editors, designers, book marketers, translators, ghostwriters, you name it. If you need them to help you get your book there out into the world, you can find them here at Reedsy. As I mentioned already before this started, we'll be having a Q&A later, so keep your questions coming, and I'll be keeping an eye on it while our guest gives his presentation. Yes, it's just past the hour. Things are a little bit weird because we're in that weird period where I think daylight savings has gone back in Europe, but not in North America, where a lot of our viewers are. So a lot of mathematics have taken place in order to achieve this seamless transition between these 2 weeks. But let me bring on my guest for today, who's an entrepreneur and author and the founder of several companies, including his latest venture, Useful Books. His book, The Workshop Survival Guide, has sold over 20,000 copies to date and follows his philosophy of creating titles that readers will be desperate to recommend. Please welcome Devin Hunt. Devin, how are you doing?
Hey, I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Really pleased to see you. Just before this, we were having some technical difficulties. I'm going to knock on wood and say that everything's going to be 100% fine from now on out. Yes, you, like me, are sort of based in the UK, but not originally from there. Where have you come from before landing in London?
Yeah, before landing in London, I was from Canada, and then I spent sort of the high school years, university years, and then my first sort of formative starting to build things years in the States, both in Atlanta and San Francisco. So sort of all over North America, a little tour, and then ended up in the UK.
Oh, nice. Well, glad to have you in the country and also here to share some of your learnings. You have a little slide deck here. I'm going to bring that up in just a second. While that happens, I'll keep an eye on the comments and I'll see you at the end for the Q&A.
Cool. Thanks, Martin. So yeah, as Martin said, my name is Devin, and I'm here to talk to you about this concept about creating recommendable nonfiction. So as Martin very kindly shared earlier, I'm the co-author of a book called The Workshop Survival Guide, and I've also been tangentially involved in the creation of two other books, The Mum Test and Write Useful Books, which are both authored by my longtime collaborator, Rob Fitzpatrick. And sort of through the process of creating these books and then starting a company, Useful Books, around building sort of useful nonfiction, we started to happen across a very interesting way of when you start to build and design your book that we found has become a cornerstone of making our book successful. With the Mum Test, Rob kind of stumbled on it by accident. And in the Workshop Survival Guide, we really started to try to do it deliberately. And to a point where I think we figured out an interesting way that if you're creating a nonfiction book, there is a way to design it that allows that book to grow in a really meaningful way beyond yourself as an author. And we call this useful books. This is our shorthand for nonfiction that goes through reader recommendation. And it's not so much what you write about, it's more about how you structure what you write about, which is, I think, is a very liberating thing. Now, before I dive into sort of this whole idea, I wanted to get ahead of the fact that we sort of built this whole thing for nonfiction books. That said, there are some aspects of this that we find are pretty useful for fiction, but we're by no means experts in creating a novel. A novel is a very artistic expression. It's something that comes from the soul. It often is trying to paint a picture that is trying to introduce something new into the world. And that is a difficult thing to define. But when it comes to nonfiction, especially nonfiction is trying to make a specific point, we find that this sort of thing is useful. But I would love to hear in the Q&A if any of this resonated with the novelists in the audience, because it's always interesting to hear how this stuff is being used. So before I go into the process, let me set the stage a bit. Let me talk to you about launch spikes versus the back catalog. So while we were researching the book, Write Useful Books, we came across this extremely powerful graph. And I'm sorry if it's very pixelated. It's from like an old publication, and it's only so big, and so you expand that JPEG and it just gets a little worse. But it's from this study called Success in Books, and basically what this graph is showing us is they took, I believe it was 1,699 New York Times bestsellers, and they figured out how many copies were sold in each week, and they graphed every single one. So this massive sort of blue blobby area in the middle of the screen is all those 1,700 books being graphed together. And so this bottom axis is showing us how much was sold in each week. So in week 0, how much was sold, week 1, all the way through to week 100. And that y-axis, the vertical axis, is showing us how many copies were sold. And if you're to believe this graph, there's a very obvious trend that it shows. And it's basically that the launch week is the make or break moment for your book, right? Whatever happens in that launch week, that is the apogee that you hit. And then it's all downhill from there. And that's a bit of a depressing idea for me, right? It's like I spent all this creative effort, creating this book, draft after draft, reviews. Maybe I've been writing in public, so I've been building an audience, like all the sort of techniques I'm trying to use to create a great book. And then it all comes down to kind of how good my marketing is, right? That little spike at the beginning, that's all based on like the podcast book tours I did, the pre-launch publications I hit, the audience newsletter I built up, the one Reddit post that went viral, right? The book talk thing that worked. Like that's the culmination of all those little author-led marketing events, spiking your book at the beginning, and then almost every book after that sort of peters off. And maybe you did a great job. Maybe you hit that viral post, or maybe you got a New York Times nod, and all of a sudden you get a bigger spike. But even the biggest spikes on this graph, you might see they still slowly decline. And there's some advice where like you're always launching, right? No matter what kind of book you're writing, maybe you're always sharing excerpts, or you're reauthoring it, or maybe you found a new channel of people who never seen your book before. But at the end of the day, it's just sort of repeating the same thing over and over again. You get a little author spike and it declines. And these spikes are great. Like we don't want to not do this, but we can sort of see it's a bit futile if we wanted a book that grows far beyond what our marketing skills are, right? And if you're like me, I'm terrible at marketing. It's not my forte. Every bit of marketing I have to do for a book or even one of my products, it's an insane amount of work, and it feels very burdensome. But there is a kind of book in this graph that is almost impossible to see because so many other books plot the same path. And they follow a path that looks more like this pink line. And basically, they have a very middling launch. They sort of often just show up in the bookstore, they show up on Amazon, they show up on Ingram Spark, and they don't really make big noise. But then they start to sell a little bit, and they sell a little bit more the next week. And, by week 100, 2 years later, they're outselling that month what they sold in the first month. And these books are called back catalog books. And they're a bit of an anomaly. They buck this launch or die trend where even though they never really had the huge marketing engine that some of the big pop science or big autobiographies have, they sort of keep selling somehow. And as they sort of looked into this and started to figure out what was driving these anomalies that often make a lion's share of money for a lot of publishers, they realized that it was the readers having something very meaningful from that book that was easy to recommend to people in a similar situation. And so what we started to discover is that while author-led marketing can create these beautiful short-term spikes, which are very valuable, I don't want to like discount them. Like we do need to do that, but they fade away quickly. There were some books that had these evangelical readers, readers who adored what was inside of it because it had a significant impact on them. And that started to create this like long-term organic growth. You know, organic growth that the author didn't control, the publishers didn't control, the agents didn't control. It was controlled by the readers. Something happened in it that was just so useful. They're like, well, that person's that problem. I'm going to tell them how I solved it. And I solved it by reading this book or using this interesting manual or whatever it was. And so these evergreen recommendations is what is like the currency that grows a book far beyond the author's reach, right? It's what makes uh, a normal book not viral per se, but something that can continually grow over time. And so it starts to become clear that what we want to do is we want to optimize for making these evergreen recommendations happen. You know, we don't want to optimize for marketing success, which often is that like last couple of weeks before a book launch. No. We want to sort of flip it and say, no, let's optimize to make it easier to share, something a little more interesting. And so we have this new goal in mind, right? We're no longer so worried about the launch week, but we're interested in how we can create a book that is maximized for back catalog success. And there's a number of ways we do this, but this is the sort of basic framework that we lay out in Lyst and Useful Books, and it's only really 3 simple steps. So a recommendable nonfiction has to serve a purpose in a reader's life, right? If it doesn't actually do anything meaningful for them, why would they recommend it? Now, again, this is about nonfiction, like fiction. Like I recommend beautiful fiction books that I read all the time because they're fun, they're enjoyable, they're insightful, they're poignant. But the reason I recommend a nonfiction book is often because it did something meaningful for me at a moment in time. So when we're designing out our book, we kind of have to start thinking about who's our reader? Who am I talking to? And why am I talking to them? Where are they in their life at that moment that I want to speak to them? It's not just a topic, right? We're not just worried about some broad topic, some big overview. And the other important thing we have to design for is that when that reader reaches for a book, they can extract that knowledge, right? They can get something out of it. They're not just like saying, oh, well, that's an interesting topic. I'm glad I'm aware of that. No, like they have something they can apply immediately to the situation they're in. And the third thing, which might seem like an afterthought, is actually the most important. We need to have a way to verify it all works, right? If we're talking to a person and we're giving them something and they try to use it, did it work? like did things get better for them or did it get significantly worse? Because we need to know that. We need that feedback loop so that we can actually start to learn. So the book that Rob and I wrote, the Workshop Survival Guide, is not about workshops. At least it's not about workshops as a concept, right? We wrote this book to help a very specific person. And that person is a professional who has all of a sudden been told they have to run a workshop and they've never done it before, right? If you work in sort of an office environment or maybe you're an educator by trade, you probably run into a situation where all of a sudden you have to give a presentation to like the company-wide team meeting, or maybe you have a big idea you want to share, but you don't really know how to structure it. Like that's what this book is written for. And this is sort of why the subtitle is like kind of the title on the book, right? We're not about helping people give entertaining talks or a TED talk or like a toast at a wedding. Like those are all types of sort of presentation environments that we could have spoken about, but we were just focused on educational workshops and people who need to run one immediately. And because of that, when I recommend this book, I'm not recommending it because it was an interesting book. I'm recommending it because I know it can help you in that exact situation you're in. And so recommendable nonfiction sort of has to tick this box. Like, is it helping someone solve a problem? Is it helping you gain insight? Maybe undergo a huge journey? And the important thing to note here is these are all relatively vague on purpose because the actual subject matter of what we talk about, I mean, that's up to you as the author. You can actually craft most nonfiction genres to sort of match what you want to make it, right? A useful book is more than just a how-to book, right? If you wanted a how-to book, you can just give me a laundry list of steps to follow. Like that's what a how-to book kind of does. But what a good useful book does is it goes beyond that and actually, one, makes it a beautiful reading experience. Two, really affects that person at that right time. So let me give you a concrete example. This is one of my favorite useful books. Now, if there are any parents in the audience and parents with young kids, you've probably been in the situation that I just went through. I have two young daughters, and obviously their birth was a both beautiful and scary experience, right? I got a baby now. What do I do? And like them growing up and learning to walk was a beautiful, scary experience. But nothing was as terrifying as when I realized that we have to teach them to not poop in a diaper, right? Like at some point, I have to teach this baby who their entire life and my entire experience with them is diapers. And this is a baby I won't even trust like a fork with. And somehow I have to teach this toddler to now poop in a toilet. It's a pretty surreal experience if you haven't been through it. And if you're like me, I just started doing research. I asked friends. I started buying books. I was reading blog posts. I was watching YouTube videos. I was like diving in. And most parenting books or just parenting advice in general kind of falls into two buckets for me. And I hate both of them. One of them is what I call the prescriptive bucket. And that's when a book basically gives you an outline of like, you do these steps and you win. And the problem I have with those books is children don't follow steps. They're dynamic, agile creatures. And no matter what sort of framework you set for them, they will buck that trend and they will break it and it'll all go to pot, right? And so I knew that those books would not work for potty training, right? I knew it. And the other parenting book bucket is what I call the overview books. And they're sort of these feel good books where they give you the broad swaths of all the possibilities there, but they never take a stand. They never give you sort of the best scenario. And I hate those books even more because you get to the end and you're like, well, that was interesting. Now I know even less. It's very, very frustrating. But what Jamie did with Oh Crap Potty Training is a bit brilliant for a number of reasons. But one reason is it doesn't talk about what the kid needs to do. It's a story about how parents need to change their mindset about parenting and create an environment where your kids can only succeed. So, yes, it is about potty training. And yes, it does give some pretty prescriptive notes. But those prescriptive notes are wrapped in a narrative around how you create a successful potty training environment and experience for everyone involved: the parents, the carers, if you have some carers at home, the kid itself. And it's such a beautifully written book. Like you get through a couple of chapters, you're sort of feeling very confident, you know what to do. It tells you like, okay, you're at stage one, do these three things. Did you do these three things? If not, you're naughty. Go back to the beginning and start again. And it helps you catch yourself when you think things are going sideways. So it's a great example of a book that's just so much more than a how-to. And another example I love to give to sort of go on the totally opposite end of spectrum, right? From teaching a child to poo to negotiating billion-dollar deals is this fantastic book by Chris Voss, Never Split the Difference. And in this book, basically, Chris teaches you to negotiate effectively, to get the soft skills to get people on your side and sort of win an argument, win a sale, win a negotiation. But it's not presented as an academic text. It's presented sort of as a memoir, as an autobiography of like his life as a cop and then an FBI agent doing high stakes hostage negotiation and then as a consultant. But throughout the book, while you're reading this sort of very interesting person's story, he's peppering you with tons of examples and different techniques and little call-outs on how to apply them to your life. So again, book is so much more than a how-to. It's an enjoyable bit of prose to read. But this is the sort of book we strive to write when we're thinking about a useful book. When someone says to me, hey, I got a sales meeting coming up and I don't really know if I'm closing the deal, I'm like, dude, sales? Okay, just read this book. Interesting book. So the useful book is basically a design choice we have to follow. And to sort of think about how we start to achieve what these people have achieved in these books, we got to think about the book writing process in general and how it might be a bit backwards. So this is our universal diagram of the book writing process, right? Or at least as sort of it is generic in the terms that we talked to hundreds of authors. And this is basically the sort of process that derived out. And it's sort of a waterfall. If there's anyone from an engineering background here, you're probably familiar with a waterfall diagram and its pros and cons. Basically, you start off with your book proposal and then you build your manuscript out, maybe version 1, version 2, maybe a third version, and then you get into developmental editing, right? And this is sort of where you're really starting to do major, huge structural changes. Maybe you're going to flip part 1 and 2, maybe you cut some chapters, maybe you got to rewrite the whole introduction to the book. But once you get past developmental editing, that structure and content is locked, right? Like you've made the big changes. And after you go through prose and copy editing, you're basically done. Assuming that nothing comes out in the sort of proofreading, fact checking section, like the book is done. And then you do your cover layout, you do your proofreading. And the crazy part of this whole massive process is you get to this final stage of review reading, and this is the first time that most of your readers will actually have touched your book, right? You've made it all this way. You've gotten to the high pressure launch point. You've made it through all the work of creating the book, and you're showing it to the reader for the first time ever at the end of this massive waterfall. And you can probably see why this might seem as a bit of an odd choice, right? If we're writing a book for a reader to enjoy it, why are they picking it up when it's 95% done? Why are they picking it up when the book is basically complete and any major changes basically mean starting from square one and losing a year of your life, 2 years of your life? It's a huge mismatch on expectation. And so this is where the useful book design choice comes into place, right? A useful book is a choice to design your book differently so that you can actually start to succeed in that recommendation process. And the basic process that we need to follow when we think about building this useful book is that if we get better feedback sooner, we're probably going to build a better book. That's it. That's the whole idea behind building a good recommendable book. So if we go back to this diagram, you notice that all the creative work, all the research, all the all the research, all the creative process, it happens here, right? Between the proposal and development and editing. And then everything down here is effectively preparation for marketing. And so we need to kind of forget about that phase for now, and we need to focus on just that red diagram. And instead of doing this very linear process of, I have an idea, I'm going to spend a significant portion of my life writing it, we need to flip it so we're doing something more like this. We need to do some work on our idea. We need to share that progress with readers. We need to get feedback on that progress in an effective way, and then go do more work, right? This is how we start to build a better feedback loop into our authorship process. So how do we do that? I mean, it sounds great, right? Like, great pitch, Devin. Sounds good. How do we do that? It seems like it's pretty difficult, especially when we may not be confident what we're writing about is even interesting. And so that's why we got to get the readers involved from the get-go. So there's 3 ways that you can start doing this today. So the first one is become the book. This is our sort of turn of phrase to mean before you even pick up the pen to start writing prose, try to actually take the content you're excited about and share that with the reader in a meaningful way. So this could be coaching them on something, consulting them on something, maybe mentoring them. So for the workshop survival guide, for example, the whole book itself was based heavily upon our own shared experience of building an education company. And we had a very unique way to designing our workshops. And so when Rob and I came across the idea of, hey, there might be a book in this, instead of starting to sit down and outline, start outlining and start actually knocking a couple of chapters to see how it feels, we reached out to a few friends and a few colleagues we know were in the space, and maybe their workshops weren't very good, their presentations weren't very good, and we offered to help them with it. Not make their workshops for them, but sit with them and watch them work and, sort of teach them our process. And it was funny. It was like we found 2 people very quickly in a couple of days. And those 2 people very quickly turned into 5 people because they were actually recommending other people to us. Oh, this other person I saw at an event, their workshop was terrible. You should go talk to them. I got their details, right? And so being the book, sort of representing the knowledge we want to share, helped us really refine the message. We quickly discovered what was really impactful for people, like what took them from 0 to 1 really quickly. And what was, academically interesting was a really unpractical or boring thing to share with people. And so before we even started writing the table of contents, we've started to shape our book. So the second thing that we recommend doing is beta reading. So beta reading is not new. It is not new at all. So the thing I want you to take away from beta reading is just share what you're writing earlier, right? So to our community members at Useful Books, we recommend starting beta reading with chapter 1, not draft 1, right? If you get to draft 1, you've put down 60,000 words, you've waited too long. You've put so much time and effort into this. What if there are fundamentally incorrect things? So you want to start your beta reading process just like painfully early. It's going to hurt. Like the first draft of Write Useful Book, sorry, not Write Useful Books, of Workshop Survival Guide that we shared, it was a couple of chapters and it was panned by our beta readers. The beta readers, by the way, were the people who we like did the book stuff with before we had any text. But it was rough. But it taught us a lot about what was interesting and what wasn't interesting. And so we went back to the writing room and started churning out more pages. We had more confidence in what would be effective and not effective. So when we did the next round of beta reading, that part went a bit better and then more comments came that were more nuanced. And the final thing you need to do to really get this little loop into your authorship process is to run follow-ups, right? This is a callback to that sort of original principles, but you need to check in with the people you're helping to see if it actually helps, right? One of our community members is writing a book on hiking trail maintenance, right? He's a very experienced hiker and sort of park ranger, and he just sees people doing poor maintenance on trails so that they just aren't as good as they could be. And his follow-ups are like going out to see the trails that people are maintaining to see if his techniques are working and see if the way he's expressing his ideas are coming across. So you have to ask these questions of like, what's working, what's not helpful, like, and more importantly, who would they recommend for this process, right? Running those follow-ups is critical to checking that little loop even makes sense in the first place. Okay, so that was a lot of like cerebral big ideas. So if there's anybody in the audience who is working on a nonfiction book, or maybe even working a book that is nonfiction tangent, is thinking, I want to start applying some of this stuff to my authoring process today, how can I start? Like, how do I take these big ideas and start doing them with my own prose or my own text? So there's a couple ways I'll suggest, and a lot of them can be done in a couple of minutes, if not hours. So the first we recommend, and we recommend this for almost any author who's joining our community, is to run a book audit. And a book audit is simple. It's sitting down and looking at the text you've written and counting how many pages before a reader really gets a bit of value out of your book, before you really deliver the core message of your book. You'll be surprised about how many sort of business books that I've read where the information contained within that book was exceptionally interesting, but it took me 100 pages to get to it. Now, that is a terrible reader experience, right? You make a promise of teach me how to do better financial planning, let's say, or like create a budget for myself. But I have to slog through 40 minutes of your backstory to get to the first thing that tells me how to save money. Like, that is a terrible reader experience. But the good news is if you catch it now, it's easy to fix, right? So do that count and like figure out where you're hiding the value and how you can scoot that value closer to the front. The other thing, to pair it on this is to start beta reading. Don't wait until you have version 1. It's too late. You spent too much time. You invested too much of yourself into this book. Start with chapter 1. We even had some authors who started with their table of contents or just like a little memo, a little abstract about what their book's going to be. The writing in public movement, which we love, I think their whole like blog about your ideas before you write them is the same sort of idea. That's a sort of a sense. That's kind of like a beta reading in public. This little screenshot here is from our tool Help This Book, which helps nonfiction authors do much more broad and data deep beta reading. And the other thing, which I find much more fun because I do lots of cover design, is check, is your promise on the cover? One of the fun activities you can do if you're getting stuck with your book is like design the cover, design the title page, design the subtitle, to sort of work out how you want people to first interact with your idea, right? Does the subtitle and the title tell you what the book's for? And then does the book match that promise? Or are you over-promising, under-promising, not promising the thing you actually are writing about? You'd be surprised how often they sort of mismatch. We always want to have this sort of very erudite and aloof title that's sort of like a pun on an aspect of the idea, and it's got a cool illustration that matches the pun, but like that doesn't do the job, right? Oh crap, potty training, Jamie's book. It's pretty obvious what it's intended to do. Workshop survival guide. We're going to teach you that workshop. And the final thing I'll leave you with, of course, and as Martin very kindly mentioned earlier, Rob wrote a book on this very process. So this talk was a very brief overview and effectively the first couple chapters of this book. So if this is a process you think is interesting or maybe can be leveraged by you to make your book more impactful, improve the text itself, and to allow that book to grow a little bit beyond you, grab the book. Grab Write Useful Books. I'm obviously very biased, but I think it's good. But that's it. So that is a very quick overview of sort of the process that we embody over at Useful Books. And I'm very excited to take your questions. Thank you so much for listening.
Great. Thank you very much, Devin. Yeah, as he mentioned, yeah, we're doing a Q&A just now. So if you have any sort of specific questions, hit them up in the chat here on YouTube. But yeah, as they sort of pour in, it takes some time for the delay to sort of work itself out. So when you were working on this, on the workshop survival guide, was there sort of a target reader you had in mind? Was there sort of a reason why you targeted that specific reader?
Oh yeah, totally. And it changed. I think so. The Right Useful Book, the Workshop Survival Guide had a very tumultuous history. We went from being extremely excited about the book to being very depressed about it. We thought it was a terrible idea, then being excited again and depressed. And it actually maps to the readers that we were trying to target. So when we first started writing the book in earnest, we were thinking about teaching people how to start an educational business, right? So not so much workshops specifically, but like you want to teach something, you probably want to make money off that knowledge. How do you sort of combine those two things? And that was very quickly, we discovered was an extremely complicated and nuanced thing. And that specific reader was very demanding on very specific advice that there was no way we could put into a book because it would be a 10,000 page long book for all the different caveats that we have to include. But in doing so, we discovered the one thing that was universally interesting was how we designed the education, right? And so through the process of trying to find that reader, we actually ended up with our real subject matter. And the good thing is, like in hindsight, that's the thing we knew more about. You know, the company that spawned the book, Founder Centric, was a good company, but it wasn't anything substantially amazing. It wasn't like an OpenAI or a Facebook where he blew up and was huge. It was just a good little business. And so yeah, the process of like finding that reader told us that one wasn't that reader, but it gave us confidence to look for the other type that we discovered there. And so in the same way, it was that little feedback loop working its way through. Yeah.
We have a question here from Daria Rudnick, Coaching and Consulting. Considering the name of this one, I assume you know the answer to this, but how do you find beta readers? I guess for you, it almost seems like you had beta readers before you had an idea to put in front of them.
So you basically answered the question. I think so. The big piece of advice here is this is why being the book is so important. Is if you can't find the reader, how are you actually going to beta read? How are you going to be the book? How are you going to do this? And so when you're starting to work on a new book, I think really focus on who you want to speak to is so important, not only to help shape the idea, but to actually go and find that person, right? I guarantee that if Rob and I couldn't find one person to help bake a better workshop, we never would have written the book, right? And so that process of going out and looking for these people is one of your main jobs if you want to build a book that's going to grow through reader recommendations. Now, how you do that is there's a myriad of options, right? The easiest way is go to where your readers are. That could be anything from like a conference to a subreddit to a bar where all professors of atomic history hang out. Like you have to do that little bit of legwork to find those people. But the good news is like with social media, it's actually quite easy to start to get embedded in those places. And if you're really being honest and trying to help someone, you'd be surprised how often people are actually quite receptive to that. That's it. So you have to go to where you think the readers are, learn about them, empathize, and then you say, hey, I'm working on an idea. Would anyone like to read the first chapter? Give me some feedback. I really want an expert, a little bit of flattery. I want an expert to give me some feedback.
So Laura Lai asks, these beta readers are never wrong. I suppose, and a lot of people have been asking about like what to do with this feedback. I guess there is a fear that, they'll be sort of focusing on the wrong stuff, or maybe they'll sort of lead you astray. Do you have an approach, a sort of way of asking very specific stuff to get the feedback that is actually useful to you without shaking your confidence?
Yeah, so there's two types of feedback you're looking for when you're doing beta reading. So the first type of feedback is the structural, factual nature. Is what I'm saying true? Is it resonating? Is it having the intended effect? And for those types of beta readers, hopefully you're being an expert enough on the subject matter that you can start to gauge if one reader is being helpful and supportive in a way that you know is good feedback or just confused and not useful. But the other kind of feedback, which is then equally important, which almost anyone can give, is the reader experience feedback. Is it easy to understand? Are they getting stuck? Where are they getting stuck? What part do you think is important that isn't getting through? What parts are useful, right? So when you're doing beta reading, you're sort of having to juggle both these things. And this is one of the reasons why we really recommend starting with just a few beta readers, right? No more than 5 on like that first go through. And those are people that maybe you've been the book with, or you've met with in person, or you know them well enough that you trust their advice. And then as you start to gain confidence in your material, then you can start to expand that out to 10 beta readers, 20, 30, 100. Some of our authors have had up to a couple hundred readers, but they always started with that core little group that they found via their own reader research, like outreach, discussion, things like that. So yeah, so it's a long way of saying, hopefully you know some of your beta readers well enough that when they're giving factual advice or structural advice, you trust that. But otherwise, they'll still be able to give you advice on if the book is even legible in the first place. And that's equally as important.
I think my colleague Ricardo is one of the founders here at Reedsy, has his book on marketing books. And those sort of spun out from these newsletters he sends out. And they go to about like 500,000 readers every week. And so, if anything, he always actively asks for feedback, and he will get a lot of it. And so I think a lot of his beta reading process is just sort of learning how to filter through things that are thoughtful and then stuff that is maybe a knee-jerk reaction.
Yep, totally. I mean, we built a tool for this, so it's a small plug. But yeah, there's hundreds of ways to run your beta reading. But we built Help This Book to run beta reading for Write Useful Books, and then we turned that into a thing because it was easier to go through. We used Google Docs originally, and that was fine when there was 5 people, but when there was 50 people, it was noise.
Noise. Yes, everything's just in the margin, and then the sort of annotations go down for like miles. Sylvia asks, does this apply to memoir? I guess there's always a very different thing. Sometimes when we talk about marketing memoirs, we talk about it almost in novelistic terms. But I suppose there are memoirs that are useful as well, I suppose.
Yeah. So I think memoirs are one of the most untapped genres for this. I think memoirs are amazing because a memoir for me, there's a story there, and in that story there's always lessons, right? There's always lessons in that story, that person's life. And some of my favorite memoirs have taught some pretty significant lessons. Like The Power Broker, for example, is an amazing book. And it teaches, it wasn't intended to be a useful book, but the lessons it taught on like how, local politics actually works and what real power and how it manifests and how that works it's a fantastic book. And we actually have a couple members of our community who are professional memoir writers. They're ghostwriters for memoirs. And what they've done with their practice is they changed it from being a simple biography, a linear story through someone's life, where they started to learn to extract like what happened in the life that's most interesting for the family members or for their local community or for whoever the memoir is sort of being targeted at. And it's really interesting when you think about crafting a memoir to think about who is the reader, who is the person I want this memoir to impact the most. And if you're honest, it changes the project. So for one of these authors, it's like, this is a project for the family to remember that person. And if that's the reader, that changes how you structure that memoir. But for maybe bigger things where someone was sort of a well-known figure in the community and maybe advanced local charity concerns or advanced local politics, maybe there's political lessons that it can be extracted so that person's legacy can go beyond just a simple story of their life, right? And so it's slight tweak, and it's a design decision. It's not really changing the substance of what you're discussing, but it's changing how you deliver that in a way to have that impact. So yeah, I think memoirs are a very interesting subject matter to go through this process. Obviously with the right sort of poise and delicacy that's needed for some of these situations.
Yeah, something you said there sort of resonates. I think a lot of folks do, especially when they're writing memoirs, try to sort of set out what they feel is success. And I guess the first thing that comes to mind is like, well, I just want to sell 1 million copies. Anything less than that and it's failed. But, I suppose memoirs and, nonfiction books, they can have purposes that aren't merely to sell as many copies as possible. Like you can sort of realign your expectations.
Yeah, I mean, one of the common causes of writing a book, especially in the business world, is not so much to have a successful book. It's to have basically a manifesto to tell people what you're trying to do with the business, right? And in that case, like you're not looking to sell 1 million copies, but you're looking to hand it to a potential customer and get them excited, right? Yeah. And that's just a very different book, right? It's a very, very different book.
Yeah, we had a guest on before who wrote a lot of memoirs and nonfiction books, and he had one client who I think was a Beverly Hills plastic surgeon who only wrote the book for the purpose of getting on morning television. So he could be like, hey, this guy's got his brand new book. He's here to talk about that just so he can get exposed to the sort of folks who watch morning television.
Yeah, we used to help people do sort of workshops and stuff like that. And the honest truth is if you have a book, you can basically double your speaking rate. So getting that book done, it might not have any audience, but if you have the book, all of a sudden you can charge more for your job. And that's
Yeah.
an upside for
Yeah, because it
sure.
becomes, you go from like, who is this guy, to, oh my God, he wrote the book on the subject? Doesn't matter if nobody
Yeah.
read it. Um, Neil Dab asks, is there any way to use these ideas for a book that is already published?
Oh, great. Yes. Great question. We get this a lot. So there are. So the most immediate change you can make is your cover, right? So if you go back and think about who's this book for, who's the reader, am I giving that reader the promise in the language they expect? You can modify the cover. And we've had authors that have done that. They have like an okay book that's selling well, but they go back and they redesign the initial experience of the book, what they see, what people are sort of relating to. And it's like a night and day change in terms of they're now talking to the right person. And the other thing you can apply is there's always a version 2. There's always the revision, right? And it's going to be painful to do it all from scratch, but a reorganization might not be. If you think of your book of building blocks, each chapter, each section is doing a specific job, maybe that order of jobs is not as efficient as it could be, right? So the Workshop Survival Guide, the book that Rob and I wrote, it basically was originally backwards. We wrote it sort of like, here's what a workshop success looks like, and we're going to break down all the steps to get there. And we thought it was a very clever way of doing it. But when we did the final beta reading, we realized that like people effectively were skipping to the end because they wanted to know how slides are supposed to look. We're like, oh yeah, I guess that's how people think workshops are. And so and spoiler alert for my business book. The slide section basically says don't do slides first. Like you should leave slides till the end. And so we moved that to the front because that's what people were wanting to see. And so using beta reading or using just basic reader experience design to like restructure an already finished book, that's version 2. And version 2 is a launch spike. So that's also a bonus. You never know.
Just one last question, and I think you're going to like this. Bob is basically teeing you up for a plug. Can you please tell us more about the tool you developed to help evaluate beta feedback?
Yeah, sure. It's a tool called Help This Book. If you Google Help This Book, and basically what it lets you do is it lets you upload your draft in any state. We support Word, Markdown, basically all the major formats. And then it creates a basically little book project page and a link that you can share with anyone who you want to beta read. And they can come in and they can get commenting from the get-go. They don't even need to sign up unless you force them to, as it'll toggle to force people to sign up. But then it lets them react. And the idea here is there's 2 types of ways you feedback. You can just click some text and say, this is useful, this is boring, this is very insightful, or you can start leaving comments. And so you get this sort of emoji reactionness where people can quickly just throw in their sort of base feeling. But if they want to, really expand upon that, they can and comment. But then we take that data and give you reports. So we show you very clearly like where the book is slowing down, where the book is actually very useful and you should expand upon it. And then you get this sort of blanket of testimonies from your beta readers. So yeah, that's Help This Book. Obviously a fan because I built it for our own book, but we have a few hundred authors using it, and they seem to be getting a lot of value out of it as well.
Cool. Speaking of getting value out of this, thank you so much, Devin, for coming on and sharing this. The book is Write Useful Books. The link is below. And I want to thank everyone for tuning in live, and to those of you watching later, you can Google Reedsy Live, the podcast, and sign up for our podcast. Of course, like and subscribe to this channel where there's new content each week. Before we sign off for the day, Devin, is there any sort of parting message you have for people who might be at the beginning of their journey looking to get into writing nonfiction?
Yeah, just what I said in the talk. Like, go find the person you want to talk to and talk to them. Get them in your cohort so you can start sharing your ideas.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone at home. Thank you, Devin. I'll see you all soon. Bye.
Thank you.